Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the silencing of the left with Truthdig editor-in-chief, Bob Scheer.
They have created an atmosphere of hysteria that if anyone questions military spending, aggressiveness, anything else, they're going to be thought to be agents of a foreign power. Come on.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. There is strong evidence that Google is suppressing public access to socialist and left-wing websites by using algorithms that divert users away from these sites when they type in certain keywords, such as U.S. military, inequality, socialism, and even figures such as Julian Assange. This censorship is being carried out as part of what Google, along with Facebook, Twitter, the New York Times, Washington Post, BuzzFeed News, Agence France-Presse, and CNN say is a campaign to marginalize fake news. Most of these organizations have strong links to the Democratic Party. RT correspondent Anya Parampel looks at the new McCarthyism that is underway to silence the left-wing press.
Alternative media is under attack like never before, particularly left-wing and anti-war outlets. Since the election of Trump, the establishment has been falling all over itself to stop the spread of what it calls fake news. There's just one problem. While the concept isn't really anything new, remember Saddam's weapons of mass destruction? Some forces have emerged to declare themselves the arbiters of fake news. Specifically, an organization calling itself Prop or Propaganda or Not came forward with a list of Russian influence operations it considers to be fake news. And while it did list RT and Sputnik, organizations which don't hide their connection with the Russian government and operate like any other state media, it also included sites like antiwar.com, Alternet, the Ron Paul Institute, Truthout, and Truthdig, all with zero evidence of the site's relationship with Russia or an influencing operation. They even included Press TV, Iran's state media channel. But this wasn't just a harmless list. Months later, Google announced it was changing its algorithm to filter out fake news, and many sites similar to the ones on that list or on that list have experienced a decline in traffic. Since Google has announced the changes, Alternet says it's experienced a 40% decline in traffic. In September, the World Socialist website reported a 75% drop in traffic since the changes took place. The attack on alternative sites led Julianne Tvetin, a reporter for In These Times, to coin the term the Russia fear-mongering industrial complex, saying the campaign is successfully marginalizing the left. RT reached out to Google and asked who exactly they consulted when designing their new algorithm and why left-wing and anti-war sites are being disproportionately affected. And they told us, quote, "Providing users with authoritative and useful information for their search query is our top priority. Because of this, we are constantly improving our algorithms to provide this type of content at scale across the wide range of topics people search for on Google. When we change our algorithms, it does mean some sites may lose visibility. Most importantly, we have never re-ranked search results to manipulate political sentiment."
Thank you, Anya. My guest today is Bob Scheer. He is the editor-in-chief of Truthdig, which has seen its traffic plunge by nearly 20% since the Google algorithms were put in place. I publish a column every Monday on the site. Scheer was formerly a reporter and columnist for the Los Angeles Times and the editor of Ramparts magazine. He is a professor at the Annenberg School for Communications and Journalism at the University of Southern California and the author of 13 books, including his latest, They Know Everything About You: How Data Collecting Corporations and Snooping Government Agencies Are Destroying Democracy. So Bob, let's talk about what we're seeing, what you have called repeatedly the new McCarthyism, only this time it's not coming from the rabid right-wing, the Joe McCarthys and of the Republican Party, but from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I consider this one of the most frightening moments, and I've been around a long time, by the way. I spent 29 years at the Los Angeles Times, legacy media, as a reporter and columnist and so forth. And I want to make one thing clear. Fake news has always been a problem. Okay, fake news comes from governments all over the world, particularly when it deals with national security. I was sitting there at
the CIA has made for decades.
I was sitting there at the Los Angeles Times 20 years after the Gulf had sunk in, which was this supposed attack, the second one on by North Vietnamese PT boats on a destroyer and aircraft carrier of the U.S. These huge ships, and it never happened.
Well, just like the attack on the Maine in the harbor of Havana never happened.
Okay,
right.
but a lot of people knew it, including the president and Secretary of Defense Lyndon Johnson and Robert. And what came out 20 years after the fact, when the key documents were finally declassified, and I wrote about it for the Los Angeles Times, they knew before they talked to the nation, the president and Secretary of Defense, that there was no evidence of an attack. They were warned by Captain Herrick. I interviewed him. The guy was on the destroyer saying, we recommend holding off. There is no evidence, Admiral Stockdale, who was the longest held prisoner of war, was up there in a plane. He couldn't talk about it because he was then captured and being one of the pilots sent over, and he ended up writing a book. He said, I was awake and go bomb North Vietnam. I said, what for? They said, because we were attacked. He said, there was no attack. I was flying above. So that's like the invasion of Iraq. We're talking really major fake news. This is not some yo-yos, somewhere in Russia or Ukraine or somebody, doing stuff. And by the way, that kind of stuff is done by every government now in the world. That's what my book was about. As Eric Schultz pointed out, you can take third-rate stuff off the shelf and be a two-bit dictator somewhere, and you can get massive amounts of information, disrupt communication. This is what happened.
But the fact is that the charges that fake news somehow elected Trump, I mean, this is, it is true that every government does it, but they've not offered any evidence.
Okay, let me address this. This is the most shameful moment for the Democratic Party establishment in, I think, maybe in my lifetime. Because at least in the old McCarthy, this is the new McCarthy period, and the old McCarthy period, okay, it was coming from the right, and the warmongers, and they were attacking Democrats in the State Department, for selling out or being subversive. Also, that red baiting campaign was based on Reds. There were red revolutionaries, and they did have a program of, revolution and so forth. The red baiting now is not directed at the last significant communist party. I wouldn't mention North Korea. Don't think was ever really a communist party, but China. Yeah. Okay, and they've turned out to be the most splendid capitalists in the world. Splendid, at least, in being able to make a lot of money and make products that people want. And Russia is run by people who I consider to be quite conservative. I wrote the introductory preface to Oliver Stone, the transcript of Oliver Stone's interview with Putin, and Putin is very clear that he thinks communism is a failed ideology. It was always a pipe dream. He thinks Gorbachev was naive to think he could save it, and he believes in this kind of variation of crony capitalism. He's unabashed in his support of what I, as a progressive, don't like. I still have an idea we can have some social democratic society that is fair and just. So the irony in this red baiting is that it's fundamentally illogical. Putin's Russia does not have a grand design to spread an ideology around the world. What it is this old-fashioned nationalism. You could trace it back to the czars, if you like. They were abused. I was in Russia covering it for the Los Angeles Times when Gorbachev was doing perestroika and glasnost and so forth. It was a feeding frenzy for American experts, NGOs, agents, blah, 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 all over the place. Yeltsin was their guy.
Well, the CIA put millions.
Yeah, Yeltsin was their guy against Gorbachev, really. And Putin came out of the St. Petersburg crowd, the Sobchak and so forth. He was brought into the Yeltsin government, and then Yeltsin, in desperation, turned to Putin because he was the only guy that wasn't a drunk and out for himself and was competent. And he said, look, I got to resign, but you got to take over. And then Yeltsin wins the election the next year against the Communist Party candidate. So the red baiting is against a guy who was an anti-communist. And they bring up, it's KGB. Well, how many CIA people you know, have we had in government? You know, what does
we
that
had
mean?
one as President
Yeah,
Bush. I mean,
yeah, you know, the first President Bush.
but let's talk about what is it that the Democratic Party, first of all, let's talk about what they're doing in terms of the red baiting, and then tell me why they're doing
there are
it.
two forces operating here, and it's so disreputable because it's basically at the heart of it petty, yet its destructiveness is enormous. One is you have legend media, as it's called, the New York Times, Washington Post, particularly the Washington Post, you know, and others, whose business model is destroyed. So the Washington Post gets saved by Jeff Bezos, who buys it as his personal property. Meanwhile, his company, Amazon, is building the cloud for the intelligence agency CIA. So you have the old military-industrial complex. And the Washington Post has been leading this attack, and the Russians are everywhere. Meanwhile, they're building the cloud for the CIA and the NSA and everything. And their guy, Bezos, owns the Washington Post. He's the publisher. So much for independent legend newspaper, but also the New York Times has been just beating the drum on this, you know, with no evidence that they've been able to come up with.
Well, so is CNN, so is MSNBC.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the publications that I really respect or have respected through my life. I mean, I like Dean Baquet, who's the editor of the New York Times. I think he's a solid fellow. I like Marty Barron, who's the editor. I mean, I've worked with these people. They were both at the LA Times when I was there, and I think it's really an embarrassment. I say shame.
So what's their goal? What are they doing?
They're doing it because their business model is broken, and this internet, this crazy, wild world, yes, and the internet is the best and the worst of everything. That's what I find exciting. I edit Truthdig, and we can, yes, we do good reporting, by the way, with traditional journalists. You know, Bill Boyarsky, who was at the city editor of the Los Angeles Times, is sort of our main political writer. You were at the New York Times. You're our leading columnist. And our copy editor is somebody who was at the LA Times, who can pull any story. So we actually are basically a publication done by people who left the LA Times or the New York Times or other places, as are many internet publications, whether they're for profit or nonprofit. But they're basically, it's convenient to the establishment papers that are in trouble economically to badmouth internet operations, okay, and say, oh, this is now the center of fake news. The fact is, fake news is exposed very quickly on the internet. That's one of the great things about it. You can say, wait a minute, I looked for the original document. I checked the history, you know, and people can find it really with dispatch.
We'll come back to that after the break. When we return, we'll hear more from Bob Scheer. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back to On Contact. Let's return to our conversation with Bob Scheer, editor-in-chief of Truthdig. So this red baiting, why is it dangerous? What is it, you know, what are potentially its effects?
Because it's disconnected with the world reality. Communism is not the menace in the world, okay? And Putin does not represent communism. He's an anti-communist. So it's an idiotic way of looking at things. As far as specific charge of who's threatening democracy, my own view is we're primarily threatened by our own intelligence apparatus that is setting a model for the world. If they can tap Angela Merkel's phone, if they can go into Russia and decide, if they can bring missiles up to the border of Russia, if they can, I mean, it's very aggressive stuff that's been going on as part of an idea that we're an imperial power. We cloak it with peace-seeking. And the lesson of our founders, it was George Washington who warned us about the impostures of pretended patriotism. If there's one truly, I mean, there's a lot of wisdom in the founders, but the most important, don't become an empire. If you become an empire, you're going to collapse like Rome and Spain and England and blah, blah, blah. And you to have a democracy, you have to have more limited sense of your relevance to the world in terms of military and so forth. What we have is a full-blown imperial outreach, you know, and it's dangerous. And the Democrats have actually more of a war party now than the Republicans. I mean, they were under Johnson, they were even under Kennedy. They're very aggressive, and it becomes like a way of unifying the nation. They claim they're doing it for a larger good, human rights or something, but it turns out not to be the case. If you read Hillary Clinton's book about her time as Secretary of State, she brags about being far more aggressive than Barack Obama. pushing into Syria, and we know what disaster is. We know she voted for the Iraq War. We know what that is about. What she did in Libya is, atrocious behavior. You got a defanged dictator, and you sodomize him, and you say, well, we came, we saw, and we conquered. I mean, this is brutality visible to the world, and the red baiting is an absurd, because there aren't reds, justification.
Okay, what are the
costs? And I'll tell you the cost. Russia still has half the nuclear weapons in the world, okay? And there is Russian nationalism. You poke your stick in their eye, and any nation, they're going to respond in ways that are not totally constructive, okay? You need Russia and China and Pakistan and India as allies, and Japan clearly, and South Korea, if you want to deal with the North Korean problem, which is real, okay? If you want to have peace in Syria, you certainly need Russia to cooperate. So we've got this crazy situation now, and same with Iraq, same with Iran, and so forth. So we have this crazy situation where hopefully Trump could have parlayed somehow personal chemistry or something with some of these Ruskies into a better peace initiative. He now has to prove he's more belligerent than anyone. Right. Otherwise, his objectivity will be challenged. So, to my mind, the demonization of any of these other countries, and by the way, even North Korea, a country that was leveled, nobody even seems to know that.
Yeah, I know. We even bombed their dams.
Yeah,
there was nothing left.
How did these North Koreans get to be so crazy? I happened to go to North Korea once, as a journalist, and I tell you, they take you to one museum after another. This is what the Chinese did to us. This is what the Japanese did to us. This is what the Americans did to us. So nationalism, same with Russia. My mother, by the way, left Russia after the revolution. She was in a group called the Jewish Socialist Bund. Two of her sisters had been killed, by the Kazakhs, and then they ran afoul of the Bolsheviks. So I was raised with that idea that the Russians don't always make right choices. But the fact of the matter is, they have history. They have nationalism. They lost 50 million in the war, in World War II, when we were very late to enter. So you keep challenging the right of anyone else in the world to have a nationalism that has any validity. Well, as you know, because you've been a foreign correspondent most of your life, I certainly know from my more limited contact with the rest of the world, everyone has got a story out there of abuse and what was done to them. And if you just act as if that none of that matters and only American nationalism, we're the only ones that were ever attacked. We're the only ones that were ever vulnerable. We always do the right thing. If you operate on that basis, now, yes, Trump is a bizarre manifestation of that with the Make America Great. But it was Hillary Clinton who said, oh, America is great, and has always been great. Always been. Oh yeah, when we committed genocide in California and wiped out Native Americans. Oh, threw had people throw babies in the fire. Was that in America? That was great. And those people, basically escape punishment. You can go through the history. Was slavery great? So this whole thing that's been ushered in by the Democrats is, to my mind, really more ominous than what Trump is doing, because Trump is a buffoon. Trump will blow, unless Trump becomes more successful in being reasonable, and he's doing some things like cooperating with the Democrats on the budget limit, and maybe he'll do something with DACA, and maybe he'll do some reasonable things and salvage his reputation. But the fact is, the cynicism of the Democrats is on full display. Play any trick. Russia took over our land. No, Russia didn't cost you the election.
Why is it dangerous? What is the blow? What do you fear in terms of the blowback?
Because they are stoking the irrational xenophobia of America, of foreign enemies. That we have to get them. And now they have very few choices. I mean, they don't want to go after Saudi Arabia, which did, paid for al-Qaeda, but they don't blame themselves for having created a situation in Afghanistan of great instability, because remember, Zbigniew Brzezinski and Carter said, we're going to give them their own Vietnam. They don't blame themselves for being indifferent or not doing enough to solve real problems. Immigration, I was on that border when Jimmy Carter was president and Leonard Castile was his head of immigration, and you had all the problems you have now. You didn't solve them. You've had all of these years to have a humane policy on the border. The biggest problem, by the way, is not building a wall or not building a wall. Because, you know, what is humane about letting people across a desert not have water? I was on those patrols and everything. It's pathetic. What you needed is a reasonable quota, recognize the connection between Mexico and the United States, have a quota at least 4 times greater than what you have for Sweden or you know, a country like that.
But Bob, what are the consequences? How could this play out?
The consequence right now is that the Democratic leadership has destroyed or subverted a progressive alternative in America. They have created an atmosphere of hysteria that if anyone questions military spending, aggressiveness, anything else, they're going to be thought to be agents of a foreign power.
Which they've tried to
doing this interview, let's cut to the chase. Just my being here doing this interview, and I've been on RT other times and so forth, you know, do I have to worry about, you know, people are going to say, you know, I say, screw you, you know, I'm not going to fall for that, but other people will. People get intimidated. They'll have to prove how independent they are. They say, yeah, look, let's blow up a city in Russia or something. Yeah, you know, we'll be tough, you know, instead of examining how did the Ukraine part solve. You know,
well, you made a point before we went on the air that in the 1950s, it was a few good people within the Democratic Party who were standing up to McCarthyism. Now, today, we have essentially those people fueling.
You had a few good people in both the Republican and the Democratic Party who stood up. Eisenhower was a person who stood up at a critical point. We don't have moderates on the Republican Party. The ones who claim to be moderate, like Rubio and so forth, are actually more irrational on foreign. They want to go to war with Cuba or something. So, and the Democrats, one would have thought, would be a place where people who supported diplomacy and complex analysis and so forth would be comfortable, except now they have embraced a totally irrational, simplistic and extreme conception of what's going on in the world. It's nutso. I mean, to be talking about the Reds, I mean, to be talking about Russia as a revolutionary country when Russia is a deeply conservative country now, and I say that not with approval, I mean, but conservative in every respect, embracing the Russian Orthodox Church. You know, I mean, they are not, and they never really were. There was always a nationalist movement, even going back to Stalin. But now it's deliberately, you know, a nationalist psychology. Why? Because they've been battered. They've been battered, and you know, and they will presumably move closer to the Chinese model, embrace a more vigorous capitalism, and so forth. But the idea that somehow Russia is this big menace is a fraud. They know it's a fraud.
We're gonna have to stop there. Thanks. Thank you for joining us. That was Bob Scheer, Editor-in-Chief of Truthdig. As long as most citizens believe in the ideas and ideologies that justify global capitalism, the power elites will remain unassailable. When these ideas lose their credibility, as they have, the institutions that buttress the ruling class deflate and veer towards collapse. An increasing number of Americans know that we have been stripped of political power. They recognize that we have been shorn of our most basic and cherished civil liberties, and they live under the gaze of the most intrusive security and surveillance apparatus in human history. Half the country now lives in poverty. Many of the rest of us, if the corporate state is not overthrown, will join them. These truths are no longer hidden. The loss of credibility is the reason the establishment, and especially the Democratic Party, is seeking to shut down voices and sites that respond to its mendacity and its bankruptcy. No longer able to compete in the world of ideas, all they have left is the blunt instrument of censorship. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. See you next week.